Hi guys and welcome to this interview question session by Intellipaat. Now RPA is one of the most in-demand technologies of 21st century. Since every industry has repetitive tasks and RPA is something that eliminates those repetitive tasks through robots, it is one of the most in-demand fields in the world right now. And UiPath is one of those tools through which you can implement RPA and solve all of your tasks which require repetitive actions. So today we have gathered here to answer few important interview questions with respect to UiPath so that you can be ready for your next interview. But before we get into all of that, please subscribe to our channel to never miss an update from Intellipaat. Now, without wasting any further time, let's just directly get into the questions. And these questions contain all kinds of questions like various different aspects theoretically with respect to UiPath, some situational questions where they give you some situations about this is the situation, how would you go about it, which activities would you use. All of that is covered in these questions. So without wasting any further time, let's just get into it. So the first question is, what is RPA? It is the most basic question which is being asked across any job interview that you have. The first question they'll ask you is, what do you understand by this term RPA? So you can answer it with the direct answer with that robotic process automation is a type of automation where machine or a computer mimics human actions and is helping you complete task based on rules, right? It is used to automate business processes, and automation is done through some robot, right? Or you can go about saying that RPA is made up of three terms, which is robotic, process, and automation. Now, robotic means anything that is done by a robot. Process is a set of sequential actions or sequential logic which leads to a desired result, and automation stands for anything which is done without human intervention. So in a nutshell, RPA stands for those actions which are done by robots where they follow some set of logical processes or set of logical standard procedures or steps in order to do some tasks without human interventions in it. That is basically what RPA is. Let's get into the next question. And the next question is, what are the various components in UiPath? So we are directly into the question of what are the various components in UiPath. So first component is the orchestrator that you can talk about. Orchestrator, this is an application used for remote control, government, and execution of those robots. You can talk about the UiPath Studio, you can talk about the UI Robot, and you can talk about the UI Explorer. Now, the proper sequence to go about it would be you talk about the UiPath Studio first, that you will say that there is a studio where you can use for designing what your bot will do, designing the logic behind what your bot will do. It is basically the bot designer. And then you'll talk about the UI robot. So once you have created those tasks, that task will be done by this thing called as robot, and in UiPath that is called as a UI robot. And these robots follow the set of sequential actions which you create in the UiPath Studio. Then you can talk about the orchestrator. Now, there are some tasks which you can schedule at your own ease and you can govern them, and this is like a web interface where you can do a lot of different things. So you talk about orchestrator next, where you can schedule a lot of different actions through this. And then you can finally talk about the UI Explorer, which you can use for spying element tools, and you can get selectors. And UI Explorer is basically used for spying some element if you want to, let's say, generalize some processes for various different kinds of tabs or various different kinds of things. And this is basically used for spying elements, right? So you can talk about these four components when they talk about what are the various components in UiPath. Let's talk about the next question. The next question is, how many kinds of robots can be configured in Orchestrator? So we just talked about Orchestrator. So how many different kinds of robots are there that you can talk about with respect to the Orchestrator, right? So the answer to this question is A, the standard robot, which is machine dedicated robots, and B, there is another kind of robots which is called as floating robots. There are two kinds of robots in UiPath which you can talk about. So standard robot is something which is a machine dedicated. It will work for specific machines only, whereas floating robots can be used for various machines. So let's assume like you have some organization you are working for, right? So every organization will have various users using the same machine, but they will have they will be logging into different domains, right? So imagine like your robot is something which needs to access various domains. Now various domains are there. So if a standard robot is there, he will only function for one particular dedicated machine. But if you have a floating robot, they can be used for various different kinds of machine, and you can run tasks using those floating robots. Now, let's get into the next question. The next question is, where are floating robots used? The answer to this question is, robots are same as the user logging into a machine. You can give them a metaphor, a kind of an example. So you can talk about it like robots are similar to the users logging into a machine. In a corporate environment, a user is attached to a domain, right? So as I mentioned before, a lot of people will be working on the same system, but they will be working in different kinds of domains. So the user is attached to a particular domain, and a domain user can log into various different machines, right? If they are working virtually and stuff like that, they can log into various different machines. So in an environment where robots are used by various machines, then in order to be useful in those scenarios, you have to use floating robots. If you are using multiple machines to run similar tasks and you want to use the same robots for running tasks in various different machines, then you use floating robots. Now that is what floating robots is. Let's get into the next question. So the next question is, where should credentials be stored in an orchestrator? Now, orchestrator is used to run a lot of different actions, right? So people a lot of times have some actions which require people putting in sensitive information like username and passwords. And when you're creating any kind of an application, it's very important that you keep those things very secure. So where would you store the credentials in an orchestrator? The answer is in assets. Assets is something that you define inside of an orchestrator, and all of the credentials that you have should be stored in assets. Okay, let's jump into the next question. Next question is, in the UiPath Robotic Enterprise Framework template, in the main workflow, what is the default type of transaction item variable? That is a little difficult question. So if you have used RE framework or Robotic Enterprise Framework, in the main workflow, what is the default type of the transaction item variable? The answer to the question is string, queue item, and object. These are the three default types of transaction item variable which you can use for which are present for you in the RE framework in the main workflow by default, right? So next question is, what is the difference between sequences, flowchart, and state machine? So let's start with the first one. What is a sequence? The sequence is actually a small type of a project which is suitable mainly for linear processes and will enable you to switch from one activity to the other seamlessly, right? And it actually acts as a single activity block, and you can reuse them many times if you want. Given below, as you can see on the screen, there is a small example of what sequence looks like in the UiPath, and this is what it looks like in the visual designer. You can see the sequence is there, and in the sequence you can have set of actions inside of it, and each sequence is responsible for running all of those actions sequentially, right? Moving along, let's talk about the next one. Next one is the flowcharts. So a flowchart, basically it helps in large jobs as well as in small projects as well. You can use them in different projects. Flowcharts basically help in presenting multiple branching logical operators and helps in building complex business and for connecting business activities in many ways, right? And there is something called as a flow switch and flow decisions, which are basically the same thing, but it has one difference, that is the flow switch. Each branch of the flow switch is known as the flow step, and it is not just restricted to true and false. So if you talk about flowcharts, let's think about it like this. So let's say you have to make some decision based on something. So you go outside, you see whether you should play cricket or not. So it depends on a factor like, is it raining? If it's yes, then you go ahead and play. And if it's not, you go to the other side. So that is what a flow chart is. You come to a point where you have to make a decision, and based on those decisions, you can flow one way or the other. So you can see on your screen down below, you can see there's an input dialog box and there is some decision being made. If it is true, you do one set of action. If it's false, then you go and you check for some other condition. So let's say if it was, let's say if it's not raining, then you check if it's snowing. If it's snowing, if the decision is true, you do not play. If it's false, then you go ahead and play, and something like that, right? So that is what basically a flowchart is. Like, you are going through various decisions, and whatever you will do will be decided on whether one particular decision is one way or the other. That is how logical things work, and that is what flowchart does. Let's talk about the third one, and that is the state machine. When a machine is using a certain number of states for automation during an execution, it is known as the state machine. It will only switch from one state to the other if the transaction is triggered, right? So let's say in the last example we talked about in flowchart, if the decision was true or if the decision was false, you will make a decision then and there. In state machines, you cannot transition from one state to the other if the condition is not met. Let's say if we are playing a game where we have to guess a number, right? And unless you guess the number correctly, you will be kept on a loop, right? So let's say if the number is 5, if I guess 1, I will be turned back to the same stage that you have to guess again. If I guess 2, then again I'll be turned back. And if I guess correctly on the 5, then I can move ahead and go to the next state. And it could be the final state and whatnot. There are various stages. But only if you met a certain criteria, you can move on to the next state. Otherwise, you will be looping on the same state as mentioned before, right? So that is how the state machine in UiPath works. So these were the differences between a sequence, a flowchart, and a state machine. So you define all of them and you compare and contrast them and how they are different. Like we mentioned here, how different flowcharts is different from state machines. Now with that, let's move on to the next question. The next question is, what is a selector? Now, a selector is something which is very important in UiPath. So to automate specific actions in the user interface, you are required to interact with various windows, right? And windows and buttons and drop down list and many other different things, right? So most of the RPA products do this by relying on the screen position of the UI elements. Now, it is a method that is not very dependable, right? So to overcome this problem, what UiPath does is they have provided this feature which is called as the selectors. Now in this selectors, you have various different things like called as wildcards, which is a symbol which allows you to replace 0 to multiple characters in a string. So for example, where you can give an example for a selector is, let's assume that you have, let's say 6 notepads are open. How does your program know in which notepad you have to go and type particular something, right? So in general, if you do not define anything, the program will directly go and type on the instance which it finds the first instance of the notepad. But if you define properly in the selector, okay, this is the window element that I want to interact with, or if then only it will go to do that. And another example of the reverse way would be if you are working on, let's say, Amazon tab, right? So if you are, let's say, trying to extract, let's say, some amount of what is the amount of, let's say, given particular item that you're trying to purchase. Now if you do it for, let's say, earphones, now the tab which is there on your screen, it will have the selectors with respect to earphones. Now if you want to automate, let's say, for any activities which for any product which you want to search for, then you can use something called as a wildcard, which is a symbol like a star, which you can use to replace single to many elements. Now if you put in star in place of the earphones in the selectors, so what will happen is it will work for any windows that is there with respect to Amazon, and it will extract information based on that. So selector is something which is used for doing automation on various different dynamic UI elements as well, and as well as if you want to select one particular item out of the various UI elements which are present on the screen. Moving along, the next question is, what are the types of wildcards in UiPath? So the type of wildcards are basically two. One is called the asterisk, which is the star symbol, which is used to replace 0 or more characters in a selector. The other one is a question mark. So question mark only replaces one single character. So let's say if my Amazon window was, let's say the title of the window was Amazon 1. And if I wanted to automate for any Amazon window, and you know that the pattern is it will be Amazon 1, Amazon 2, Amazon 3. So what you can do is you can just put Amazon and just put a question mark in there. So that way, any of your automation which is working on an Amazon window screen can be automated. But let's suppose you wanted to click somewhere and you did not care what the title of the image was. So what you can do is you can replace the entire Amazon 1 window with a star. In that way, it will look for every title which is there on your particular given window. It can go on any of the screen, and based on the other selectors that you have defined, it will go and properly do the automation based on your particular selection, right? So that is about wildcards. So let's get to the next question. The next question is, what is the difference between full and partial selectors? Now again, a very important question. What is a full selector and what is a partial selectors? A full selectors basically contains all of the elements needed to identify a UI element, including the top level window generated by the basic recorder, and it is recommended to use you are recommended to use full selectors when you are switching between multiple windows in your automation. So let's say if you are switching multiple tabs one after the other, In that case, you need to use full selectors because it will give you the entire information containing to identify a particular UI element. But let's say if uh, you are not switching in between a lot of different things, right? You're using similar tabs. So what you can do in that? So partial selectors are generated by desktop recorders. Last time it was done by the basic recorders, and this is done by the desktop recorders. It does not contain information about the top level windows. That is the first thing that you should keep in mind. Other thing is that activities containing partial selectors are enclosed inside a container like attached browser or attached window that contains full selector of the top level window. It will have something already which is there of the top level window, so you do not need those selectors now. Now we recommend you to use partial selectors when performing multiple actions in the same window. An example of partial selector would be the editable panel in the notepad. So if you are, let's say, working in one particular notepad and you want to do editing with respect to that, you do not need the entire partial selector. You can just entire full selector. You can use the partial selector for running those activities, and it is recommended when you are not switching a lot of tabs and you are working on one particular window, then you have to use partial selectors. If you're working on multiple windows, go for the full selectors. So moving along, the next question is, what are the types of recordings available in UiPath? So the types of recorders which are available in UiPath are basic, desktop, web recorders, as well as Citrix. So these are the four important kinds of recordings which are present. You can use any one of these for your use, and majorly all of the questions which will be asked to you with respect to recordings will come from Citrix automation because it is different from the other three, and that is the most important one, right? So the next question is automatically on that. If an interview asks you what are the various kinds of recordings, you can think that the next question will be, what is Citrix automation in UiPath? An answer to that question is, Citrix automation in UiPath is used for operating the virtual machine. If you efficiently want to process the automation in Citrix machine, then you want to use Citrix automation. And if the interviewer asks you for an example, the most simple example that you can give is, most of the companies, they do not work on their physical systems, right? You do not work on your physical systems, you work on some virtual machines. Now UiPath only has access to the resources of the system that it is installed in. So let's say if I am using some virtual desktop on my PC, right? So my UiPath only has access to the mouse elements and all of the other information that it has the access to only on my system. It does not have the information with respect to that virtual system, but you can still do automation tasks with respect to that. How do you do that? So Citrix automation basically takes a lot of images for doing the automation. So it looks at the images which you are going to mark as in your logic, and it will work according to those images on the window screen which you have presented in with respect to that. Like actions like go and click there and click here will not work in a Citrix automation because you do not have access to the resources of the mouse of that system. You do not. You have the access of, let's say, writing something on your particular keyboard, and that will be replicated in that particular window of the virtual machine. So that is how somewhere you can use a Citrix automation. It uses its ability of doing image processing for doing virtual automation, right? So that is when Citrix automation is used. Let's get on to the next one. What are arguments in UiPath? So as you would know, there are different kinds of variables which are present in UiPath, and arguments is one of the special kind of those. So basically arguments are used to pass data from one flow to the other. They have specific directions, which is in, out, and in and out. These are the three different directions which are there with respect to the arguments. And arguments are basically used to pass data from one project to the other, one workflow to the other. Additionally, arguments have a specific directions. In means that the variables which you have or the data which you have is being passed and not returned. And if you have the parameter as out, then it basically means that the value of the parameter is being passed to a function is not of that much importance, then it is being returned as well. So that is what basically arguments is. If let's say you have two workflows, one where you have the logic and where you present the output, then you use arguments for pushing. Let's say if my program depends on the user input of let's say I'm doing multiplication, right? So in one workflow I am taking the input from the user, which is let's say number A and number B. So I will pass that number A and number B to my logic which is present in the other workflow. I will send it there, and you can do A star B in there, or A into B, or whatever it is the action which is the logic is there. It will take those numbers, it will do the In this case, I'm having the in argument as I'm sending the data, I'm putting in the data from some other workflow to this workflow. And as I get all of those done, I can put an out type of parameter and I can return back the variables to the first workflow, right? So that is how basically you use the arguments in UiPath. Let's get on to the next one. What is switch and flow switch in UiPath? As we've talked about this before, there was this basically with respect to flowcharts and flow decision making. So we have two different kinds of activities, which is called as switch and flow switch. Let's just talk about that. So the switch activity basically enables you to select one choice out of the multiple based on the value of the choice of the expression that you have specified. Whereas a flow switch activity works like a flow decision, except instead of being restricted to a true false branch, each branch of a flow switch is called a flow step. So switch activity basically enables you to select one of the choices based on the multiple parameters that you have. Whereas the flow switch basically is not just true or false. It will take you through another branch of activities, and these branch of activities is called as a flow step. So next question is, what is exception handling? Now, exception handling mainly deals with errors with respect to various activities in UiPath. The error handling activities offer up to 4 options that you can use to resolve your errors, and one is rethrow, other is terminate the workflow, and then there is throw, and there is try catch. So you have a try catch block where you try to catch whatever the error is, and then if there is some exception that you know, then you throw an exception, and then you try. If you throw an exception, then your try and catch block will try to catch those exceptions and work accordingly. Other than that, you can terminate the workflow as well as rethrow some of the exceptions that you have, right? Moving along. So another question which is asked very often is, what is the difference between data scraping and screen scraping, right? So we have mentioned the differences here in a tabular format so that it's very clear to you. So screen scraping is used to extract non-structured data where you want to extract elements from your particular given screen. If you want to do that, then you use screen scraping. Whereas data scraping is used to extract only structured data from, let's say, an Excel file or a table or stuff like that. Data scraping is done in such a format. Whereas the scraped information in screen scraping is stored in a string, whereas the data scraping information is stored in a data table, right? So data table is another kind of variable format where you can store a lot of values like a table, and a string is basically your expressions mentioned in any way, right? And the third difference is that you cannot easily extract the data into Excel or DB when you are using screen scraping, whereas the whatever the data you are scraping can be easily moved to your Excel or any DB for that matter, because it's already in the format of a data table. It's very easy to write a data table to an Excel sheet. If you have worked with UiPath, you would know that very easily that the data table writing is much more easier. And screen scraping can be used to extract data from images as well as PDF, but you cannot do that with data scraping. So if I want to, let's say, if I have if someone presents me with an image which has some, let's say, some sentences written in from it, and if I want to extract data from that, I will be using screen scraping rather than data scraping. And if there is some website where the data has been mentioned inside some table, or if it's in some structured format, in that scenario I will be using data scraping. That is the difference between screen scraping as well as data scraping. Now moving along, next question is, what is anchor and find element? Now an anchor base is something which is a container that searches for a UI element by using other UI elements as anchor. This should be used when a reliable selector is not available. So for example, let's say if I wanted to type username somewhere. So let's take example of Facebook. So there is a place you have to write username and there is a place you have to write password, right? But there is a problem with respect to Facebook that they keep on changing the relative location of where that particular box is. Let's say it was on the top right hand side corner in the initially, then they move it to the left hand side corner, or they moved it somewhere else. So you know that they will be changing where is the position of that box every time, right? So what you can do is you always know that they will be putting this box next to this element, which is next to this thing called as type username or and type password. So you know that this where the box where you have to enter data will always be next to this thing where they have written this thing called as name, enter name. So what you do is you anchor your next action around this element, which is the username. So it will look for the username on the entire screen. So wherever that username is, and that username is your anchor. So wherever it finds that username, it knows that there is a box next to it, and it will try filling the details inside of those box next to that username, no matter where it is present in the screen. So even if they keep on changing the UI, you know that all you have to do is you have to find that username anchor, and when you have found that anchor, you can just put and write those elements, right? The other thing is, which is find element. Now find element is something where you wait for a specific UI element to appear on the screen, and when it returns, when it is there on your screen, it will do the actions according to those operations. So a very good example of this would be, sometimes it takes some time to load your website, right? Sometimes you would be slow in loading your website. So what you want to do is you want to anchor your elements around something which is there. So let's say if you have a slow internet connection and you define a complete UiPath program. So if it involves, let's say, opening the website and doing some actions, what your program will do, it will open the website, and as soon as it opens the website, it will directly go on doing the actions whether or not elements have been loaded on the screen, and that way it will lead to an error because it cannot find those elements, right? So what you want to do in those particular scenarios is you will uh, wait for the screen to find, let's say if I was trying to log in on my Intellipaat screen, I will wait for the anchor element, or I will wait for my program will wait for the action which is find element, where I find the element Intellipaat logo. If and only if the Intellipaat element, the logo is found by my program, only then I will continue and do the remaining rest of the actions which is there, right? So you can do like that. You can select something when and your program will wait for that element to pop up, and as soon as your element pops up, then you can go about doing the different actions that you want to do with respect to finding elements. So it basically waits for some UI element to present itself on the screen, and then you can go about doing the action. Whereas anchor is used to locate wherever you want to work if you know that there is something which is more reliable as a selector, right? Moving along, the next question is, what is the difference between IMAP, get Outlook, send Outlook, and SMTP? Now these are the various different activities which is there with respect to your email automation. Your email automation gives you these different options which you can use to work around various things, right? So basically, IMAP or IMAP stands for the Internet Map Access Protocol. Through IMAP, we can receive the customized mail, right? And get Outlook, which is the other activity. Through this, you can get or retrieve various static mails. So if you have static mails, you can get through the get Outlook. Similarly, SMTP stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, and it is used for sending dynamic mail. Whereas send Outlook, through this activity, you can send static mail automatically. So that is the various difference between the IMAP, get Outlook, send Outlook, and SMTP protocols which are there on the UiPath, which you can use for email automation. Now let's talk about the next one. So the next question is, list the OCR engines available in UiPath. Now if you know, OCR is basically stands for optical character recognition. Now it basically means that, let's say if you have an image, you have an engine that can see that image and can tell you if in that image the written word is something like, let's say, work, and it can basically know what are the characters written in that image. So let's say if I have written W somewhere, the engine will be able to identify what that image character is. So it will look at the image and it will tell you that character looks like a W, similarly like that. So in UiPath, what are the various OCR engines available? And the answer is, there are majorly three present. One is Google, other is Microsoft, and the third is ABBY, or AB, whatever you want to call it. So these are the three OCR engines available in UiPath. Moving along, what is the break activity in UiPath is the next question. Now, a break activity in UiPath is basically used to stop a particular loop at a given point of time. So you can use that to do other activities as well. So it is majorly used for exiting a loop when there's a lot of iterations involved. So let's say if I am checking for some order ID, right? And if let's say checking of that order ID requires me to go through a lot of different loops. So if I know that the particular element has to be let's say greater than 5. So if I check the number, it's starting from let's say if it's 5. So the number which is present to me is 7. So I go for the first loop, I check if it is greater than 5, then I say, yeah, good, go ahead. Then I go for the other one, the other loop. Or another, let's take a simpler example. Let's take the example of a prime number. If you want to only proceed if the given number is prime number, right? So you will take the number, let's say the number is 7. So in order to find any given number is a prime number, you have to divide it till n by 2, right? So after n by 2 it will not be a prime. So let's say if I am trying to find if a number is positive, is prime, and the number is 13, I divide it by 2, it becomes 6.5. So any number, if it can divide it before 6, then only and only then it will be a prime number, because after that it will be let's say if I was 7, then 7 on the 7 and 7 twos are is 14, it will become more than that. So if that number cannot divide it, and then the next iteration of the number will not be able to divide it because it will be greater than that number, right? So for checking that prime number, I'll be going through 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, then 8, then 9, then 10. You are going through this loop, right, till you divide it till 6, right? You are going till 6 if the number is 13. But assume if the number was 12 and you divide it by 2 and you find that the number is not prime at all. So you do not need to go through the iteration of 3, 4, 5, because you already know that this number has already been divided by something, and there is no need for us to go through that loop because we already know that it's not a prime number. So in that scenario, what you do is you use a break activity to break that particular given for loop and just go outside of that activity and go through the next one. You break through that particular loop and you can go through the next one, right? So break activity is used in such a fashion. Now, moving along, the next question is, what is an orchestrator? Now, Orchestrator is basically a web application that enables us to deploy, schedule, monitor, and manage robots and processes. Many people use it for scheduling because let's say if you have some repetitive task which has to be performed at 6 a.m. every day, you can schedule it through Orchestrator, and you can have things like assets and queues and different items that you can populate and have some business logic behind it, and you can find out if those logics were successful or failure based on your defined logic. So that is the use of the orchestrator. Is, as the name suggests, it will orchestrate all of your actions. That is, it will manage that everything goes smoothly. So it is used to deploy, schedule, monitor, manage various kinds of robots and processes inside of UiPath. Moving along, the next question is, what is RE framework, and explain its components. So RE framework is a framework which is provided by UiPath to help developers build quicker and apply best practice principles to their particular workflows. It gives you the fundamental code to create more robust processes, and this involves a clean start and exits and automated recoveries, retries, status management, logging, and clean coding. Different parts of, or the different components of RE framework are init, get transaction state, process state, and end state. Now, init is basically used for reading the configuration and initializing all the applications in your given workflow. Get transaction state basically reads the transaction item from the queue. Process state gives you the process of the transaction item, process state of the transaction item. And end state basically closes all the applications which you have initialized earlier, right? So that is that. Moving along, the next question is, what is a machine and why it is used? So the machine page basically enables you to provision and manage various machines, right, with the purpose of using them to use the registered robots to the orchestrator. So when you want to have robots working through orchestrators, then you need to have some registered machine through which you can provision them to work on them, right? It basically displays the existing machines and all of its different types of machines that there are there with you. So there are two kinds of different machines as well. It enables you to create your own machine, be it be standard machine or a template machine. You can have two kinds of machines, standard machine and template machine, right? Going along with that question itself, so in the machine only, we'll talk about the two different kinds of machines, right? So if you have asked that you mentioned that there is a standard machine and there is a template machine. The standard machine, it should be used when the name of the machine on which you want to define robots remains the same each time that you connect to it, right? And you define machine once, and then you can connect any number of robots in the robots page to a standard machine. So basically, if you want to use the same machine again and again, and you do not need to define it again and again, basically you can define it once and you can attach any number of robots that you want to a standard machine. Whereas a machine template is used when the name of the machine on which you want to define robots changes every time. So you define this entity once and then connect it any number of attending floating robots in a unique Active Directory username. So basically, it is kind of a machine template where you define it so that you can attach any number of floating robots that can come and work on it. So that is what a machine template is. Moving along, let's talk about what is the difference between a workbook read and Excel read range. So what is the difference between read range of the Excel one and what is with respect to the workbook read range which is there. There are two options in UiPath if you remember for read range. So Excel read range must be used in Excel application scope only, whereas workbook read range do not need Excel sheets to be open. So when you're using the Excel read range, it should be defined in an Excel application scope, which is also a part of UiPath activities. You have to use that and then go through and work through it. Whereas workbook read range does not require that. Other than that, in my personal opinion, I find the workbook read range to be much more faster and robust when compared to the Excel read range. Now, there are different things with respect to Excel read range, which gives you other kinds of benefits, but personally, I prefer workbook read range much more. And in order to use Excel read range activity, we must have Excel installed on our machines, whereas we do not need Excel installed for using workbook read range. So if you are using Excel application scope, then you need to have an Excel probably MS Excel installed on your machine and working properly. Whereas that is not a requirement with workbook read range at all. You can use it with any CSV file that you have. You can use it with LibreOffice or anything else which is present for you. So moving along, suppose there is a URL which is dynamic. How would you automate that URL in UiPath Studio? Now, this is a situation-based question. They have given you that they have a website which is dynamic in nature. How would you go about automating that website? So what you have to do is you have to use the UI Explorer to extract the selector and use the dynamic selector using the star element, which is the asterisk, which will replace one or more characters. And in your URL element for changing the value, you have to use the star element, and also you can use screen scraping to get the value. You can use two methods. An example of the selector would be, let's say, uh, if I wanted to see like the web browser will be there, right? So this is the selector for a web browser. So HTML Chrome is the application that we are using, right? The app is Chrome. So Chrome we have set it that. So title basically stands for you have various windows that you open in your particular web browser, right? And each window in that each tab has a title. So if you want, if you have a website that's whose title keeps on changing, let's say one example would be Amazon, whose title keeps on changing continuously, then in that case you can use a star to replace one or more characters so that you can automate activities on that particular dynamic website. So that is how you use UI selectors in automating a particular dynamic website. The next question is, suppose there are 1000 rows and 50 columns, and suppose I want to select any random row data, how can it be done? So basically what we are going to do is we have to build a data table first. So you have to assign like DT variable, which is the data table variable, to a new data table. And once your table variable has been initialized, you can assign a random int, and you can have it defined in such a way that you can have new random dot next 0 to DT variable rows count -1, because when you do rows count, you have starting from 0, right? So when you are going to let's say reference that particular number, so let's say if I wanted to get the fifth column according to my coding would be the fourth, because it will start counting from 0 1 2 3 4, whereas in Excel it starts from 1 2 3 4, right? So that's why DT variable rows dot counts -1. Now this will give you a randomly generated number between 0 to n, where the number of rows in your data table will be counted, right? We subtract one bit because of the reason that I've mentioned before, right? And you can assign a random row and use dt variable dot rows dot in bracket random. It will return the random number that you want to take into account. So if any random row if you want to attack, you can use that. Or you can use, if you know which column you want to extract, you can directly use the number as well, right? So that is how you output a random row of the random row data type. Cool. Moving along, if suppose there is an image PDF of which is of 120 dp, would you extract data? How would you extract data from that image, and which automation would be used, right? So to extract any image, as I mentioned before, you can use screen scraping or you can use OCR. There are two activities which you use. To extract data from an image size of 120 dB from PDF, we need to use read PDF with OCR activity, and the automation we need to use is PDF automation. So they have mentioned here that it is a PDF, so you can use read PDF with the help of OCR because it is of the form image, it is not in the native form. That's why we are using OCR activities. We can also use Microsoft OCR activity to extract data from the image of the PDF file. You can use that as well. Moving along, if suppose there are two Excel sheets and you want to merge them, how would you merge two Excel sheet data into one? How do you go about doing that in UiPath is the question. The answer is fairly straightforward. First, we need to read the range of both of the Excel files. We need to have data tables created for both of them. Then we need to use merge data table activity to merge the data tables of the two Excel files that we just created through read range. Then we need to use the resultant data to make the merge Excel file, and you can write that data using the write range activity, right? So read both of the Excel sheets, build two data tables, then use the merge data table activity to merge both of the data table. After that, take that new data table that you have merged and use the write range activity to write it anywhere that you want. Moving along, can UiPath run multiple instances of the same process within one robot in one system simultaneously? The answer is yes, it can run the same program simultaneously in two robots, where each system is registered as one robot, right? So answer is yes, you can do it. There is no problem with respect to that. Next and the final question is explain append range in UiPath. Now, append range in UiPath is basically used to edit or insert data into the existing workbook. With using the append range, we can insert the data from the last written data of the workbook, and you do not have to worry about the previous data being replaced. So whenever we do that, we will not overwrite the data. So that is how it is different from write range. So write range, if you do that, it will start writing from the first instances, and any data that you have will be overwritten. So let's say if in column 2 I had written some number ABCD or some random thing which is there, we will overwrite the data with the new data that we have. Whereas when we use append range, we do not overwrite the data. We write it wherever the data which is written has ended, we write after that point, and then we go about writing that. So that is about all of the question, guys. So with that, we come to the end of this session. So if you have any queries with respect to any questions in this UiPath interview questions set, so if you have any questions here, you can write a comment down below. And if you have any more questions that you want to get answered, you can leave that in the comment box below as well, and we'll answer that immediately. Other than that, if you want to talk about any different things, the numbers are on your screen. If you want to enroll with us, you can just go about it. Or if you want to find out what certification fits your resume, you can reach out to the toll-free numbers mentioned here. Our course advisors will look at your resume and be happy to help you, happy to assist you on how you can make a better resume and make yourself a better candidate for the next job which opens up according to your resume. So with that, I would like to end this session. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.